This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dahlia Shenlin. I'm your co-host together with Gilad, and we'll be talking every week about literature and research and ideas that have caught our fancy. Our guest today is an assistant professor of sociology and anthropology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Yael Berda has been a human rights lawyer in the past. She did her PhD at Princeton in sociology, and she is also a Harvard Academy scholar at the Academy for International and Area Studies. Her forthcoming book is called Permit, and it analyzes the Israeli practices of surveillance in the Palestinian population in the West Bank. Professor Yael Berda, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
So your book brings a different angle, or for many people, it would be a different angle on what the occupation is. I think many people in the West think of the occupation as a matter of settlements encroaching on Palestinian lands, but you look at it as a matter of the bureaucracy that manages Palestinian lives. Why did you choose that aspect, and what is the role of that aspect in the control of the Palestinian population?
So the bureaucracy of the occupation, which was something that I actually had to call it that, it wasn't being called that. Nobody was actually thinking about that. And so I kind of stumbled upon it. I realized that it was like 2004, and I think it was Doctors for Human Rights, Physicians for Human Rights, an organization really interested in health, that wrote this tiny booklet called The Bureaucracy of the Occupation. And it was mainly about getting health and humanitarian permits. And it was really tiny, maybe 20 pages. And I read the report, and I was seeing and hearing things. I was representing different people, both Palestinians and employers, that needed work permits. And I realized there was this massive set of organizational practices and routines that branched from the border police to the civil administration to military to government offices, for trade, for employment. And then I realized, hey, first of all, this is not just in the West Bank. It's entirely also in Israel and Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And nobody knows about this. Nobody knows. Nobody except people who were victims of it.
Nobody except
themselves.
Every single Palestinian.
Well, but as an experience, Palestinians knew exactly what this was. They could not see it as this vast, mammoth bureaucracy that had everything to do with a political economy of employment, employers, goods, and movement that was structured around the Oslo Accords. And it was also the first moment where I really realized that the Oslo Accords might have been much more detrimental to the Palestinian people than the situation that existed before.
Because it started only after the Oslo Accords. I'm trying to understand what was really the starting point here, because you did say it's also in Tel Aviv. So I'm assuming that everyone, to an extent, even Jews, is subjected to this kind of bureaucratic mammoth. How does it work?
I didn't. Then I'll backtrack. What I meant by saying that it's in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv is that the offices that made decisions about this were in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv.
Part of the broader Israeli
bureaucracy. But are we, as Israeli Jews, exempted from that?
Well, you'd be part of it if you were trying to employ Palestinians in any way. So as an employer, yes, you would be subjected to it, and in many ways part of this arbitrary set of practices that has everything to do with racial hierarchy and very little to do with what we're kind of used to thinking of as administration or rule of law, then you would be subjected to it. But otherwise, you wouldn't be.
So it's essentially a Palestinian issue.
I think we may need to go back a little bit for people who don't necessarily realize that what was the situation before the Oslo Accords, after the Oslo Accords in the 90s, and then by the time you started noticing it in 2004?
This story begins actually the early 70s, when few years after the occupation, then Defense Minister Moshe Dayan advocates for a solution that would open the borders. It would mean that Palestinians could work in Israel, and they would have freedom of movement during the day, but had to go back to the West Bank and Gaza by night. And that this created an economic dependency, both of Palestinian workers on their income coming from Israeli employers and also of employers, whole sectors that were absolutely dependent on Palestinian employment. And this continues basically till 1991. 1991 is the point where the general exit permit is canceled and it's decided...
Exit from the West Bank.
Exit from the West Bank,
And
which
Gaza.
is a closed military zone.
Right. And Gaza.
And Gaza. We're talking about these are closed military zones. Moshe Dayan says we're going to let everybody move. And then in 91, it all goes back to that Alice in Wonderland moment where they're closing the territory and each person needs to get a permit personally.
So let me just characterize this. Before 91, there's sort of a blanket exit permit unless there's an exception. But by default, most people can get out of the West Bank and Gaza. And after 91, there's a blanket closure and you need exceptions to get
Exactly.
out.
What happened in 91? It was before the Oslo Accords.
Madrid. So not only Madrid,
The peace process. For our
Madrid peace
listeners who don't know.
process, the Gulf War, and a bunch of other geopolitical, and of course, the end of the Cold War and big geopolitical changes. So, I mean, this is all in the backdrop of this. How is this related? We probably need a little bit more time than we have right now to discuss that moment. But it's beginning in 91. And journalist Amira Haas was the first to notice this issue of personal permits. She notices it in Gaza in 1989. She writes up, as usual, she always knows a few years ahead what is actually happening from the ground. And so
because she's based in the West Bank. Then she was based in Gaza. Or she's the Palestinian Affairs correspondent for Haaretz newspaper.
Yeah, Palestinian Affairs correspondent. But more than that, I mean, when I think today about what we know about the occupation, I think basically it's her scholarship that is a backdrop of most of what we know of how it works and what did work. In any case, so there's that moment in time in 91, and then the Oslo Accords kick in September 1993. And then in 94, there's the Paris Protocol, which is the economic annex of the Oslo Accords. And this was extremely influential in shaping the relationship in terms of employment and movement between the West Bank and Israel. Basically, it said is that Israel would determine how many laborers would come in at will. It wasn't a question that would be decided together. It wasn't something that was going to be discussed jointly.
And it wasn't a security question.
It wasn't a security question. And this is one of the things that we tend to forget because everybody thinks that the movement regime is justified with the issue of security as a necessity to protect Israeli citizens from terrorist attacks. Now, when you start looking a little bit deeper, first of all, you see that there's permits to the settlements that are given almost freely, in the sense that you don't have the bureaucracy of the occupation that I write about is about entering Israel. And not about working in the settlements.
So Palestinians can work almost freely in the settlements.
Well, it's not
settlers.
Exactly freely.
No.
Settlers have to want them to work on projects, and then the security organizer of the settlement, who is usually a civilian, has the final veto. So instead of having the Secret Service and the police deciding who can come in, you actually have the security officer of the settlement deciding who can come in. But we're talking about thousands of people that are working in settlements. Now, if they were dangerous, then there isn't. If they're dangerous to Israeli citizens per se, then there shouldn't be a difference than if they are going to work on settlements or they're going to come inside Israel.
The permits is not only about traveling from the West Bank into Israel, it's also about traveling within the West Bank, isn't it?
It is also traveling within the West Bank and during periods of high violence or volatility. So you're going to have issues with moving within the West Bank and having permits within especially between the North and the South. This was extremely important in 2002 when there was a siege on Nablus for at least 3 or 4 years. I'm not exactly sure of the dates. So then those permits were very, very important. But when we talk about the permit regime, we're talking about permits to work, permits to visit family, and humanitarian permits. So you're talking about the major issue is employment. After that, you have the issue of trade. and then the issue of medical care.
And the
stuff
issue of
like that.
going back and forth between Gaza and the West Bank?
Yes, which is a completely it's another set of permits. Now there are 101 types of permits in the permit regime. It is the most sophisticated population management system in the world.
Quite a symbolic number.
Does anybody
Quite a symbolic
know?
number.
I mean, apropos 101, which is usually the symbol for the simple courses in university. Is anybody capable in any of these different government agencies of seeing the whole picture?
So that's a really interesting question, and for me, a lot of my research was devoted to the plan. I wanted to know if this was planned.
Was there a master plan?
Was there a master plan? And it wasn't like, okay, let me be sinister about this and see where the smoking gun is and, where were the people sitting around in the room, and going, he, let's do this. It was really to think, this has incredible political, financial, social implications, not only for Palestinians, but also for Israelis. So did anybody think about this ahead of time? The answer was no, and still, when we see the different guidelines that have been very recently released, 2015, 2016, the COGAT, the Coordination of
Government Activities in the Territories.
Thank you. So they released the guidelines. So basically, you still see that the set of guidelines is based on like ad hoc emergency decisions that then become routinized. I called that the routinization of emergency. It's actually one of the principles of this bureaucracy. It's like, oh, we have a situation. Let's deal with it. Okay, let's make a special permit for the seam zone, for agriculture, for people that need to go into their land. All right. And then you make that permit as an exception, and then it becomes a category into itself, and then it gets administered into the system. It becomes part of it.
Well, this leads me to a question about one of the other articles you've written about comparing Israel's system to India. And what you've argued there, if I understood you correctly, is that in India, those laws were codified into the actual civil legal system with the transition from colonialism. But in Israel, there was this ad hoc sense of emergency laws that were sort of routinized but never quite actually brought into the civil system. What is the consequence of that kind of difference?
So basically, my argument is that so in Israel and in India, both actually post-colonial states that were British colonies of different types, there was the emergency defense regulation. And the emergency defense regulations were a very strong executive tool for basically doing whatever it was that the government needed to do against a population that was hostile in the way it perceived it. And so what I'm saying is, in India, they decided to take some of these laws and turn them into laws of the Indian parliament, already as early as 1952. At the same time, in Israel, the use of emergency defense regulations became the way to do things, not only on a security basis, also for financial reasons. For instance, in 1985, when they wanted to regulate inflation, again, they used the colonial emergency defense regulation. So it became a mode d'emploi, the way that the government works. And what I think is that it actually allowed for much less legitimacy in Israel to use emergency regulations against the majority Jewish population. And that's why it was used only against Palestinians. While in India, it was used against everyone. And so in a sense, there's kind of a good thing about that because less people were targeted, but
they were targeted racially.
But it is, at the end of the day, in the DNA of Israel. I mean, my question to you isn't it completely independent of the occupation? Would we have seen, well, maybe not similar, but around the same neighborhood, that kind of provisions, that kind of regime, even if the occupation had not taken place? I mean, you also see it in pre-occupation Israel.
And maybe India is the counterfactual.
No, so I think that what's really interesting here is that it's true that we had another military government in Israel that everybody seems to forget between 1949 and 1966 over the Palestinians of Israel. And in it, too, it was a regime of movement that worked on permits. It also worked on emergency regulations. I don't think, though, first of all, I'm a sociologist of organizations, so I don't think that states have DNA.
Right.
They
Okay.
might have institutional logics. And as an institutional logic, you always have to have the issue of legitimacy, and it always has to be consistently enforced and maintained and reinforced. And in that sense, there was very, very vehement opposition to the military government. Menachem Begin in 1962 is calling it the thing that will delegitimize the state.
Menachem Begin, not just
Menachem Begin.
Yeshayahu Leibovich.
Opposition leader from the right.
And at that point, he was talking about the military government of Arab Israelis.
Yes, and so there
Maybe we
was.
should just say for our listeners that until 1966, because not everybody knows this, until 1966, the Arab Israelis or Palestinian citizens of Israel were governed by an Israeli military government, or at least large portions of them in the country. And then only half a year after the end of that military government, Israel then captured the West Bank, Gaza.
So in
and
a
the other
way,
territories.
we only had 6 or 7 months to know what Israel was like without having a military government. So we don't really know what the institutional logic of peacefulness kind of is.
No, but even more than that, I mean, and again, comparing Israel and India is very useful here because they both hail back to the British colonial system. To what extent is really this the heritage of British colonialism to us?
The book that I'm working on now, which is called Administrative Memory and Colonial Legacy, is exactly about that. It's trying to figure out how much of the organizational templates and scripts that we use in Israel and in India and in Cyprus around population management, around the conflict and partition are actually the legacies of British colonial rule, and how much of it is already an innovation, or how much of it becomes already part and parcel of the state itself. And it's a hard thing to know how much it's. We can even ask it about ourselves. What each one of us carries.
Nature and nurture. thing,
Yeah, and it's exactly what
characteristic.
kind of legacy do we carry from the institutions that we learned in, from the places that we worked in, from the people that we are surrounded by. And so organizations are similar in that sense. And the state is a fantastic organization to ask this question because it has so many different kinds of parts. What I think that I'm seeing, and that's why I call it administrative memory, it's not like collective memory that is entrepreneured and told and retold, and people think, hey, how do I use history to kind of create this collective identity? It's something that is almost innate. It almost happens by itself. It's routines that are used because that's what's available. It's forms that are useful. Mm-hmm. It's like I interviewed Meir Shamgar, who was the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and I said to him, when you were military advocate general, why did you decide to use the emergency defense regulations for the occupied territories? He was the guy that decided to use it. And he was also a person that the British had used those same defense regulations to deport him as a member of the Etzel in 1944. I said to him, how did you use the very same weapon, legal weapon that was used against you? And he thought for a long time, maybe 15 minutes. And he said, it's what we knew. It's what we know.
It sounds like a classic victim become oppressor, but if all of our tsuras comes from the British, maybe we should join the Palestinian lawsuit against the British. Or let me ask you a different question, which is related, and I can't resist bringing in Foucault because you bring in Foucault. And you talk about Foucault's concept of a boomerang effect, where a colonial power uses these kinds of special systems, states of emergency or other kind of special military governmentality forms of control over the hostile population, but then somehow those tools come back to the original country and become part of their governing culture of their own people. Can you talk about how you think, if you think that's actually happening in Israel today, or as I often put it, what happens over the Green Line cannot stay over the Green Line and bleeds back in. Do you agree with that? Why? Where do you see manifestations of this?
I'm totally with you on that. And it's not just that it's not that it comes back and forth. It just doesn't stop. It doesn't stop at a border because we know that an organizational practice is something that is embodied. It's carried within people and within laws. And when we have a certain kind of logic, then it morphs. It's called isomorphism in organizations. Organizations are going to mimic each other. And they mimic each other even when they need to do it and even when they don't need to do it, just because that's the way an organization should look. And when you ask some of the bureaucrats that work in the West Bank, say in the civil administration, and then they have to come into Jerusalem and do 2 days of work in the Jerusalem headquarters. And you ask them, is there a difference in what you do? And they say, well, it's not that like I come in from Bet El and then I stop at the Malcha Canyon and I take off a spacesuit and I wear different clothes and then suddenly I have a different logic to the way I do things. No, I'm exactly the same person. I'm bringing examples from this, and that in that sense, the territories are no different. And perhaps they've never been, because when you have one law, one set of organizations, when you have, it might be different logics, just like we apply different logics at home and in our work. So we're able to compartmentalize that difference. But when you're doing the same type of work just in different areas under different legal regimes, that's going to carry over. And so you can't quarantine an emergency. Mm-hmm. You can't quarantine an emergency. And that's how it becomes routinized and it becomes part of the administration.
I want to ask you, as a former practitioner, as a human rights lawyer now in the reserves, what is really the...
I usually call it recovering. Recovering human rights lawyer. It might be my entire life. I might need to recover.
But I have to say that our listeners cannot see that you have a big smile on your face when we talk about your days as a human rights practitioner.
No, I'm just trying to understand what really is the scope of the change that can be afflicted by human rights lawyers on maybe, denting this big juggernaut just a bit.
So here's what I think. It's both a pessimistic view and an optimistic view. I left lawyering because I realized that even when I won, I lost. And actually, even when I won, I lost to the system much more.
Explain what that means.
Okay, because it's either you look at the system and you can have an opinion about its legitimacy. But as long as you're within the logic of a system that uses emergency and exception as part of its daily routine, and it uses racial hierarchy, which means separate laws for different kinds of populations as a daily routine, you can win on a specific case, but you need to take it out of the context, the political context, in order to win. And by doing that, you've already lost the fight. You might win the battle, but you lose the war. And so what I see today is that it really is a political question. It's a question about political power. It's not a question about laws. Like even the idea it's against international law, that's not the problem. The problem is that people are being deprived of their rights. The problem is inequality. It's not, I don't care why that inequality has been brought about. The problem is you have different types of people in the same territory that live acutely different kinds of life because of their rights and because of the denial of rights that is being denied and structured by governments and militaries. And in that sense, it's not very different than a lot of other places in the world. It's just a very extreme case in which you can see it as the sheer military power that is creating these divisions. And in that sense, I think that we can learn a lot from also about human rights and the limits of human rights, and especially about human rights not being neutral politically. And that's where I think the real danger lies. No, it is not neutral. And yes, you do have to choose a side. And you cannot be for human rights and for the occupation. And you cannot be for human rights and for racial hierarchy. It's just that doesn't work. Doesn't work.
All right. On this rather optimistic note, I would say.
Very clear in any case.
Yes. we will have to wrap up. Dr. Yael Berda, Assistant Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at the Hebrew University, formerly in Princeton, and currently also at the
Harvard Academy for International Area Studies and Area Studies.
Mm-hmm. Author of a forthcoming book, Permit, it's going to be published soon by Stanford University Press. Thank you very much for joining us today.
And also a big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick, or just listen to every single one of them. Don't forget to visit our new website, Tel Aviv Review, one word, .org. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. And join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.